He betrayed me and thought he'd take everything, but in court, the tables turned. The wedding was perfect, or at least that's what everyone said. The flowers were exquisite, cascading down golden stands, their fragrance filling the air with an intoxicating sweetness. Guests marveled at the grandeur of the ballroom, the shimmering chandeliers reflecting the happiness that seemed to radiate from the couple at the center of it all. The groom, a confident and ambitious man, held his new bride's hand tightly, whispering promises of forever. She believed every word. After all, they had built a love story that seemed unshakable, two people deeply in love, ready to conquer the world together. She had supported him through his struggles, stood by him when his career was just a fragile dream, and now, standing before family and friends, she felt certain their sacrifices had all been worth it. As the years passed, she devoted herself to their life together, often putting her own dreams aside to ensure his success. She had once been a promising entrepreneur, a woman with sharp instincts and a hunger for building something of her own, but when he needed her, she shifted her focus. She managed their finances, helped with business connections, and played the role of the perfect wife. She attended events where she was expected to smile and listen while he took center stage, boasting about his achievements. She assured herself it was temporary, that soon he would acknowledge her contributions, that soon she would reclaim her own ambitions. But time passed, and instead of gratitude, she noticed something unsettling. He began to act as though she had never played a role in his rise. The first signs were subtle. He stopped discussing business matters with her, dismissing her insights with a casual nod instead of real consideration. Then, the late nights at the office became more frequent, his phone always turned downward when he was home. Friends whispered about rumors, but she brushed them aside, convincing herself that their love was strong enough to withstand anything. She had spent years believing in him, in their marriage, in the foundation they had built together. The thought of betrayal seemed impossible, almost laughable. But doubt had begun to creep in, silent but persistent, waiting for the moment it would shatter her carefully constructed world. In the early years, when his business was still struggling, she had been his anchor. She was the one balancing their finances, ensuring every bill was paid even when money was tight. While he worked on expanding his company, she took on extra responsibilities, using her knowledge to make connections, find investors, and craft strategies that kept them afloat. He had always been ambitious, but ambition without direction was reckless. She provided the structure, the stability that allowed him to focus on growing. She had no official title, no paycheck to match her efforts, but she never cared. His success was their success, or so she believed. The turning point came when his company finally broke into the industry, securing its first major contract. The moment should have been one of shared triumph, a milestone in the journey they had taken together. Instead, he accepted the accolades alone. She watched from the sidelines as he took credit for ideas she had helped shape, for negotiations she had guided him through. It wasn't just about being unacknowledged, it was about being erased. His colleagues treated her like a mere accessory, a wife with no real understanding of business. Even he, once eager to share everything with her, began speaking about his achievements as if they were his alone. When she voiced her concerns, he laughed them off. "You worry too much," he would say, pressing a kiss to her forehead before changing the subject. At first, she convinced herself it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were secure, that they had built something strong together. But deep down, resentment started to build, slow and corrosive. She told herself that patience was the key, that one day he would remember who had stood beside him through the struggles. But as time passed, she wasn't sure he even saw her anymore. It started with the way he spoke to her. The warmth in his voice had dulled, replaced by something more dismissive, almost impatient. His gaze, once filled with admiration, now skimmed over her as though she were merely part of the background. He no longer asked for her opinion on important matters, and when she tried to offer her thoughts, he would wave them away as if she were being intrusive. At social events, he introduced her with a forced smile, as though her presence were an obligation rather than a choice. She told herself it was just stress, that success had brought pressure she couldn't fully understand. But deep down, a quiet, nagging fear took root. The late nights became more frequent. At first, it was an occasional meeting that ran longer than expected, then a string of networking events he insisted she didn't need to attend. When she asked about his absences, his explanations were always perfectly reasonable, always just believable enough. But it wasn't just his absence that troubled her, it was the way he had started treating her when he was home. Conversations became short, superficial. His patience with her seemed to wear thin over the smallest things. She would suggest a weekend getaway, hoping to rekindle what they had lost, but he would claim he was too busy. She reached out, trying to hold on to the connection that once felt effortless, but he pulled away. The most painful realization came when she overheard him on the phone late one night. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the sound of his voice, low and urgent, had stopped her in her tracks. "She doesn't need to know anything," he had said, his tone cold, detached. "As long as she stays out of my way, everything will go according to plan." She felt the air leave her lungs. He wasn't just distracted. He was hiding something. And whatever it was about her. The gala was meant to be a celebration of his company's 10th anniversary, a lavish event filled with industry leaders, celebrities, and media coverage. She had always been at his side for these occasions, the supportive wife who had helped build the empire he now claimed as his own. She had spent weeks preparing, ensuring every detail was perfect, choosing a dress that would make her feel like she still belonged in this world. But the moment they arrived, she knew something was different. He barely acknowledged her presence, rushing off to greet investors while she lingered near the entrance, feeling more like an outsider than a partner. The final blow came when he took the stage to deliver his speech. She listened as he recounted his journey, painting a picture of a self-made man who had conquered every obstacle alone. He spoke of hardships, of perseverance, of brilliance that had led him to this moment. Not once did he mention her. Not once did he acknowledge the sacrifices she had made, the years she had dedicated to supporting him. The audience applauded, hanging on to his every word, while she stood frozen, the weight of his betrayal pressing down on her. As the applause died down, a woman in the crowd leaned in close and whispered, "You must be so proud of him." The words were meant as a compliment, but they cut through her like a blade. She forced a smile, nodding numbly, but inside, something shattered. This wasn't just neglect. This was intentional. He had erased her from the narrative of their lives, rewritten their history to suit his own ambitions. And as she watched him bask in the spotlight, she realized something: she wasn't just losing him. She had already lost him. That night, after the gala, she made a decision. The doubts that had plagued her, the suspicions she had tried to ignore, she could no longer push them aside. She needed answers. As he slept soundly beside her, she quietly took his phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through his messages. At first, there was nothing unusual: work emails, texts from colleagues. But then she found it. A message from an unknown number. "Don't worry, darling. She won't stand in our way. She still thinks she's important." Her breath caught in her throat. Her worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't just about neglect. He had already moved on. And now, He was planning to take everything. The morning after the gala, the weight of the discovery sat heavy in her chest, but she didn't confront him. Not yet. There was a strange clarity that came with the pain, a sense that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was a carefully constructed plan, one she had been too trusting to see until now. As she prepared breakfast, her hands moved automatically, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment that had led to this point. Every dismissal, every cold glance, every carefully worded excuse, it all fit together now, like puzzle pieces forming a picture of a man she no longer recognized. He sat across the table, scrolling through his phone with the ease of someone who believed he had already won. He had rewritten their story in his mind, convinced she was too weak, too naive to fight back. That evening, after he left for another late meeting, she sat at their kitchen table and stared at the life they had built together. The house they had chosen, the furniture they had picked out after hours of debate, the photographs lining the walls, all of it felt like a lie now. Every framed smile was a snapshot of a woman who had believed in her husband, in their future, in the promise that they were partners in every sense of the word. But now, every detail felt tainted, touched by the hand of betrayal. She could feel it in the way her skin prickled when she walked through the rooms, as if the house itself knew it was all about to come crashing down. Yet, as much as it hurt, there was no time to grieve. If he thought she would crumble quietly, he had no idea who he was truly dealing with. The confrontation didn't come with screaming or tears. She approached him with the calm precision of someone who had already seen the full extent of the damage. When she placed his phone in front of him, screen lit with the incriminating message, she watched his face closely. There was a flicker of shock, quickly replaced with something colder, indifference, even annoyance. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice flat, as though even bothering to explain was beneath him. But the lie was thin, the kind designed for someone who wanted to believe it. "I've been under a lot of pressure. I just needed someone to talk to," he added, as if emotional betrayal was somehow more forgivable than physical. His excuses were well practiced, but she was no longer the woman who would accept them. When she asked him directly if he was seeing someone else, there wasn't even a pause. "You've been so consumed with the house, with your little hobbies," he said, dismissing her like a child who had been a minor inconvenience. "I needed someone who understood the real pressures I'm under." There it was, the confirmation she needed, wrapped in condescension and cruelty. He didn't even try to apologize. To him, she had become invisible, a background character in the story of his success. She was no longer worth lying to, no longer worth sparing. That realization stung far more than the affair itself, but it was also the final push she needed. He had underestimated her for the last time. The divorce papers appeared on the kitchen counter 2 days later, delivered with the sterile detachment of a business transaction. His name was stamped boldly at the top, and the terms were clear. He intended to walk away with everything. The house, the savings, even the business they had built together were all listed under his ownership. There was no recognition of her contributions, no acknowledgement of the years she had spent holding their life together. To him, she was little more than a nuisance to be swept aside, a loose end to be tied up so he could move forward unburdened. It was more than greed. It was erasure, an attempt to rewrite history where her presence no longer mattered. She stood in their kitchen, the legal papers trembling in her hands, but the tears that threatened to fall never came. There was no room for grief anymore, no space for self-pity. The man she had married was gone, replaced by someone who saw her only as an obstacle. She could either sign away everything she had built or fight for her place in the life they had created together. And in that moment, standing in the center of the home she had once loved, she made her choice. He wanted her to disappear quietly, to accept her fate with bowed head and trembling voice. But that wasn't who she would be. Not now. Not ever again. The betrayal cut deeper than she ever thought possible, but it wasn't the worst blow. What truly broke her was the realization that the affair hadn't been recent. It had started years ago, back when they were still building their life together, back when she still believed in him. A friend, hesitant and pale, confessed the truth one afternoon over coffee, unable to keep the secret any longer. The other woman hadn't just been a fling. She had been part of his world for a long time, a woman who had sat at the edges of their social circle, watching with a smile while her affair with him blossomed in the shadows. It wasn't just infidelity. It was calculated, deliberate deception, one that had existed alongside their marriage for longer than she could bear to know. Every memory was tainted now, every milestone marred by the presence of someone who had stood in the wings, waiting for her turn to take center stage. She went home that day feeling hollow, like her entire life had been rewritten without her consent. And yet, beneath the devastation, something stronger began to stir. If they had both conspired to push her out of the life she had built, they would soon discover that she wasn't leaving quietly. The humiliation came swiftly, not in the privacy of their home, but under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. At a charity event they had once planned together, he arrived with the other woman on his arm, their laughter ringing out across the room like a bell signaling the end of her era. She stood across the room, unseen and unimportant, watching as guests whispered behind hands, exchanging glances full of pity. The other woman wore her jewelry, the earrings he had given her for their 5th anniversary, dangling from ears that had no right to them. The whispers stung, but what hurt more was the way he looked at her, like she was a relic of the past, a forgotten chapter in the story of his life. He didn't avoid her gaze. He held it, daring her to make a scene, daring her to crumble under the weight of it all. But she didn't. Not then. Not yet. The humiliation was complete, but the battle had only just begun. What they didn't know was that she had spent the last few days preparing for war, and every whispered insult, every smirk exchanged between them only added fuel to the fire. They thought they had already won. They were wrong. The days after the public humiliation were strangely quiet, as if the world itself had paused to let her process the wreckage of her life. But instead of collapsing, she found herself sifting through the debris with a steely focus she hadn't known she possessed. It was in the middle of this silence that an unexpected message arrived, an email from an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. It was Melanie, a woman she'd met in college, back when both of them were still imagining bright futures. Melanie had gone on to become a successful attorney, carving her path in the world of high-stakes divorce cases. The message was simple: I saw the pictures. If you need me, I'm here. No pressure. Just say the word. The email sat open on her screen for a long time before she replied, her fingers trembling only slightly. The idea of asking for help felt almost unnatural after years of being the one who handled everything alone. But this was different. This wasn't just about saving face or clinging to pride, this was about survival, about reclaiming the life she had been systematically written out of. When they met for coffee the next day, Melanie listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. By the time the story was done, Melanie's jaw was tight, her hands folded neatly on the table. "You're not going to fight alone," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "If he wants a war, we'll give him one." Melanie didn't waste time. Within days, she had assembled a small team to start peeling back the layers of their financial history, uncovering documents, tracing transactions, and mapping out the empire they had built together. What they found was both shocking and validating. He hadn't just excluded her from his professional world, he had actively hidden assets, shuffling money into secret accounts, sheltering properties under corporate names she had never seen before. It was a web of deceit spun carefully over years, all designed to ensure that when the time came, he could claim it all as his own. Each discovery felt like a slap, a confirmation that her instincts hadn't been paranoia after all. Melanie's team worked with quiet efficiency, gathering evidence piece by piece, until they had built a map of everything he had tried to hide. Every dollar shifted without her knowledge, every contract signed with her contributions erased. It was infuriating to see it all in black and white, but it also gave her something she hadn't had in months, a sense of control. For the first time in years, the truth was in her hands, and with it, the power to fight back. If there was one thing her husband had always been certain of, it was that she would never stand up to him. He had built his success on the foundation of her silence, confident that her loyalty would outlast even the most profound betrayals. That arrogance had become his blind spot, the crack in the fortress he had so carefully constructed. Every time they crossed paths, at social functions, in the hallways of the house they still shared, he barely acknowledged her, convinced she was too broken to pose any real threat. He spoke to her with patronizing pity, as though he were doing her a favor by offering her scraps from the life they had built together. But behind her composed smile, the storm was already gathering. She played her role to perfection, letting him believe she was still lost in the haze of heartbreak, too wounded to see the truth. Every patronizing remark, every dismissive glance only strengthened her resolve. He thought he had already won, that the papers on the table were a mere formality. What he didn't realize was that while he had been busy celebrating his victory, she had been quietly gathering her army, and soon, the war he never saw coming would begin. The hardest part wasn't the waiting itself, but the restraint it required. There were nights when she wanted to scream, to throw his lies back in his face, to expose him in front of his shiny new circle of admirers. But Melanie had been clear, strategy over emotion. Every move needed to be calculated, every step deliberate. This wasn't just about winning a divorce settlement, it was about dismantling the image he had so carefully crafted, piece by piece. And for that, patience was key. So she smiled at events, exchanged pleasantries when necessary, and let him believe she was defeated. In the quiet moments, she documented everything. Old emails, text messages, even handwritten notes tucked away in drawers, all of it was evidence of the life they had built together, proof that her contributions had been fundamental, not ornamental. Melanie's team dug deeper, uncovering every shell company, every undisclosed investment, every account she had been deliberately cut out of. It was a game of patience and precision, and as difficult as it was, she understood its importance. When the time came to strike, there would be no loose ends. The final straw came unexpectedly, not with some dramatic revelation, but with a casual cruelty that left her breathless. She had come home early from a meeting with Melanie, her mind already swirling with plans for the next step, when she heard laughter coming from the living room. His laughter, bright and full, the way it used to sound when they were still in love. But it wasn't meant for her. The other woman sat curled up on the couch, her legs tucked under her, sipping wine from a glass she recognized as part of their wedding set. The sight of her, so comfortable in the house she had built, was almost too much. But it was what her husband said next that truly broke her composure. "I can't wait until all of this is over," he said, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch. "Once she's out, we can finally make this place ours." They were already dividing up her life, her memories, like they were worthless trinkets to be discarded. It was in that moment that her patience turned to steel. There would be no more waiting. The battle would begin, and when it ended, they would learn exactly who they had underestimated. The day of the first hearing arrived with an eerie sense of calm. The courthouse loomed ahead, its gray stone exterior cold and unfeeling, but she no longer felt like the woman who had been discarded so carelessly. As she stepped inside, her heels echoed against the polished floor, each step measured, steady. She saw him standing with his attorney, dressed in the same confidence he had worn throughout their marriage, convinced that this was nothing more than a formality. He barely spared her a glance, as if she were already an afterthought, something to be erased with a signature and a settlement check. But as soon as Melanie arrived, the energy in the room shifted. The quiet hum of conversation among the legal teams turned tense as documents were exchanged, their contents forcing her husband's smirk to falter for the first time. Melanie's team had been relentless in their pursuit of the truth, and now, everything he had tried to hide, every undisclosed asset, every fraudulent transaction, was laid bare in black and white. When his attorney leaned in to whisper hurriedly in his ear, she saw it, the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was small, but it was there. And it was only the beginning. As proceedings began, her husband remained composed, still believing that his name, his status, and his charm would carry him through untouched. His attorney spoke with authority, painting him as a man who had built his success through hard work, a husband who had generously supported his wife despite her lack of personal ambition. The narrative was carefully crafted, designed to cast her as someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps were offered. She watched as he sat back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for the judge to agree. Then, Melanie stood. With practiced ease, she slid a folder onto the table before the court, flipping it open to reveal the financial records they had spent weeks gathering. "Your Honor," Melanie began, her voice smooth, controlled, "what we have here is evidence that the plaintiff has not only misrepresented his assets but has engaged in deliberate financial concealment to deny my client her rightful share." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The judge's expression darkened as he flipped through the documents, the weight of their contents sinking in. Across the room, her husband's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. His confidence, once unwavering, was beginning to crack. The next hour unraveled everything he had spent years trying to protect. Melanie moved methodically through the evidence, presenting shell companies, hidden bank accounts, and property titles signed under names that weren't his but were undeniably linked to him. Each revelation landed like a blow, stripping away the carefully constructed facade he had built for himself. His attorney scrambled to object, to dismiss the findings as misunderstandings, but the numbers didn't lie. She didn't need to say a word. She simply watched as the court dissected the man she had once loved, as the arrogance in his posture shifted into something closer to panic. For the first time, he was in a position he couldn't control, a situation he couldn't charm his way out of. And as his world began to crumble around him, she felt something unexpected, relief. Not because she wanted revenge, but because, for the first time in years, she wasn't the one being silenced. She had a voice again, and the truth was speaking louder than he ever could. But the most unexpected turn came not from the courtroom itself, but from the woman who had once stood at his side so smugly. His mistress, the woman who had so eagerly stepped into her life, had been pulled into his financial schemes in ways she hadn't fully understood. When confronted with the reality of the fraudulent accounts, the tax evasion, and the legal repercussions, she made a choice. It took only one meeting with her own attorney before she realized that standing by him meant sinking with him. So she turned on him. In a statement that sent murmurs rippling through the courtroom, she admitted to signing documents at his request, trusting that he was acting within legal bounds. "He told me it was all routine," she said, her voice unsteady but clear. "I didn't know I was helping him hide money." It was the final nail in his coffin. His betrayal had gone so deep that even the woman he had left his wife for was willing to cut ties to save herself. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. Now, he was watching his empire collapse, piece by piece. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered his ruling. Her husband sat motionless, his once confident expression replaced with something hollow, empty. The decision was clear: she was entitled to half of everything, not just the assets he had declared, but the hidden ones, the ones he had fought so hard to keep from her. The fraudulent activity meant he would face further legal consequences, ones that extended far beyond their divorce. His carefully crafted legacy was in ruins, his reputation tainted by greed and deceit. She didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in watching someone fall, even when they had done everything in their power to destroy her. But there was peace. For the first time in years, she felt free, not just from him, but from the weight of the past, from the illusion she had clung to for far too long. As she left the courthouse, stepping into the crisp afternoon air, she breathed in deeply. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something that, for the first time in a long time, belonged entirely to her. The aftermath of the court ruling was swift and unforgiving. With the judge's verdict cemented in legal stone, her husband found himself stripped of everything he had once taken for granted. The house he had tried to claim as solely his now belonged to her. The bank accounts he had so carefully hidden were frozen, the funds divided as mandated. Even his business, the empire he had built on lies and deceit, faced scrutiny as investors began pulling out, wary of being associated with a man now publicly exposed for fraud. His downfall was not just financial, it was social. Once celebrated in his professional circles, he now found himself a pariah. Former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be linked to someone whose name was now whispered with disgust. The woman he had left her for had disappeared, having realized there was nothing left to gain from standing beside him. And through it all, she watched from the sidelines, not with glee, but with the quiet understanding that this was not revenge. This was justice. He had built his success by erasing her, believing he could take everything and walk away unscathed. But fate had a way of balancing the scales, and now he was the one left with nothing. His mistress, once so smug and secure in her position, wasted no time distancing herself. The moment the financial records were laid bare, her devotion crumbled under the weight of self-preservation. Without his money, his influence, or his promise of a future filled with luxury, she no longer had any reason to stay. She had been drawn to the power he once wielded, the image of success he had carefully curated. But now, he was nothing more than a disgraced man scrambling to hold on to the remnants of a life he had already lost. She ended things with a cold efficiency that mirrored the way he had treated his wife. A quiet text message, a blocked number, and just like that, she was gone. Perhaps, for the first time, he felt what it was like to be discarded so easily, to be seen as nothing more than a temporary fixture in someone else's life. She didn't waste time thinking about what happened between them. The mistress had never been her enemy, just another woman who had believed his lies. But there was a small, undeniable sense of satisfaction in knowing that the man who had so callously replaced her had now been replaced himself. The media caught wind of the scandal within weeks. What had once been an admired businessman's divorce case had turned into something far more scandalous, an exposé of deception, financial misconduct, and personal betrayal. Articles dissected the details, painting him as a man who had attempted to outmaneuver the law and had failed spectacularly. His company's stock plummeted, and his partners, desperate to salvage their own reputations, forced him out entirely. He was no longer the successful entrepreneur he had once pretended to be. He was a cautionary tale. Public humiliation followed him everywhere. Business acquaintances stopped returning his calls. Events where he had once been the guest of honor now had no place for him. The high-rise apartment he had intended to move into with his mistress was out of reach now, and with legal fees piling up, he was forced to downsize. She heard through mutual acquaintances that he was struggling, that he had begun to drink more, that the confidence that once defined him had crumbled. But she felt nothing for him anymore. Whatever sympathy she might have once had been buried under years of betrayal. This was not her concern. She had her own life to rebuild. For the first time in years, she woke up feeling truly free. The weight that had once pressed so heavily on her chest was gone, replaced with something unfamiliar but welcome: peace. The house, now legally hers, no longer felt like a battlefield filled with ghosts of the past. She repainted the walls, replaced the furniture, and with each change, she reclaimed a space that had once felt like a prison. It was no longer a house built for him. It was a home built for her. She began to rediscover herself in ways she hadn't thought possible. The career she had put aside was waiting for her, and with the settlement money, she had the means to start fresh. Opportunities that had once felt impossible now felt within reach. And beyond career aspirations, she allowed herself to dream again, to travel, to experience life without the shadow of someone else's expectations looming over her. She was no longer just someone's wife. She was her own person again, and for the first time, that was enough. Just when she thought she had finally settled into her new life, an unexpected message arrived. A name she hadn't heard in years appeared in her inbox, a business rival of her ex-husband, someone who had always admired her intelligence even when she had been hidden behind the role of a silent spouse. He had seen the court case unfold, had followed the details of how she had been instrumental in exposing the truth. And now, he wanted to offer her something, a position at his firm, a place where her skills would be valued, where she would no longer be overlooked. She hesitated at first. The idea of stepping into the corporate world again, of proving herself in a way she had never been allowed to before, was daunting. But then she realized something: this was exactly what she had fought for. The opportunity to reclaim what had once been stolen from her, to step forward as the woman she had always been meant to be. And so, with a deep breath, she responded, "Let's meet. I'm ready." The next chapter of her life was waiting, and this time, she was walking into it on her own terms. The news of her ex-husband's decline trickled in through acquaintances and mutual friends. Once a man who commanded rooms with arrogance, he now barely managed to hold on to what little remained of his reputation. The job offers he had expected never came. The industry he once thrived in had turned its back on him, unwilling to risk association with someone who had been exposed so publicly. His former business partners had severed ties, leaving him scrambling for opportunities that were no longer there. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, only to find that, in the end, he was just as vulnerable as anyone else. She never sought out these updates, but they found their way to her nonetheless. She learned he had moved into a modest apartment, a far cry from the luxury he once flaunted. The car he had been so proud of was gone, sold to cover debts. And worst of all, the people who had once surrounded him had vanished, proving that his relationships had always been built on status rather than loyalty. It was a harsh lesson, but one of his own making. And though she felt no joy in his suffering, she couldn't deny the satisfaction in knowing that, for once, the consequences had caught up to him. Amidst the whirlwind of rebuilding her life, she found herself at an industry event, one she had once attended only as a silent observer at her husband's side. But this time, she was there as an equal, a professional with her own achievements and ambitions. She navigated the room with confidence, engaging in conversations she had once been excluded from. And then, just as she was about to leave, a familiar voice called her name. Turning, she found herself face to face with someone she hadn't seen in over a decade, Daniel, a former colleague and friend from her early career days. The years had been kind to him, and though his face held the marks of time, his warm smile was unchanged. "I almost didn't recognize you," he admitted, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You look different. Stronger." They fell into easy conversation, reminiscing about the past, about the dreams they had once shared before life had taken them down separate paths. He had heard about the divorce, about everything she had endured, and there was no pity in his voice, only respect. "You deserve every bit of success coming your way," he said before they parted. And for the first time in years, she believed it. Love had been the furthest thing from her mind. After everything she had been through, the idea of opening her heart again seemed like a risk she wasn't sure she wanted to take. But life had a way of surprising her. What started as casual meetings with Daniel, lunches between two old friends catching up, soon turned into something more. He listened in a way her ex-husband never had, valuing her thoughts, her experiences, her opinions. He saw her not as an accessory to his success but as someone with her own worth, her own place in the world. It was unfamiliar, this feeling of being with someone who truly respected her. There were no grand declarations, no whirlwind romance, just a slow, steady realization that she could trust again. That love didn't have to mean sacrifice. That partnership could be built on mutual admiration, not control. And one evening, as they sat on a quiet balcony overlooking the city, he reached for her hand and said softly, "I don't want to rush you, but if you're ready, I'd like to be someone you can count on." And for the first time, she didn't hesitate. It was a coincidence that brought her face to face with her ex-husband one last time. She was leaving a cafe when she saw him, sitting alone at an outdoor table, staring at his phone with a vacant expression. He looked thinner, his once pristine suit slightly wrinkled, as if he no longer had the energy to care. He glanced up and met her gaze, and for a brief moment there was something in his eyes that almost resembled regret. But she had long since stopped searching for apologies that would never come. He didn't speak, didn't attempt to approach her. Perhaps he finally understood that there was nothing left to say. She gave him a polite nod, not out of kindness, but out of the simple acknowledgement that their story was over. As she walked away, she felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet sense of finality. The past no longer held power over her. She had fought, she had won, and now, she was free. The life she had once imagined for herself was gone, but in its place was something far greater, something she had built with her own strength, her own resilience. The business opportunity she had taken had flourished, giving her the financial independence she had once sacrificed for someone else's dreams. Her home, once a battleground of memories, had become a sanctuary, filled with warmth and laughter. And with Daniel by her side, she had found something she never thought possible: love without conditions, without expectations, without fear. As she stood on her balcony one evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The woman she had been, the woman who had given everything for a man who had never truly seen her, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and wholly in control of her own destiny. And as she closed her eyes and breathed in the cool night air, she smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. A life reclaimed. A future finally her own.